So this is an introduction to Moja Global, but by looking at Moja Global, the important part is that how we got to the concept of getting to Moja with the open source. So I'll go with a little story rather than jumping in straight away. The genesis of the Flint was we were working with the Clinton Foundation. We were also working with some highly talented individuals in Kenya, and we were trying to develop at the time a fairly sophisticated monitoring system. We had a lot of very good remote sensing data. We had a lot of very good other data, but we had nothing to integrate that data with. And when we looked at the existing integration tools, which we will go into more tomorrow, which were things like the CBM CFS3 that Werner has developed for over many years, and FullCam from Australia, and some of the spreadsheet models that have been developed, we realised that none of those would meet the future needs of Kenya, nor would they meet the future needs of numerous other countries. And that's no criticism of those tools. It is that those tools are just were developed specifically for their needs. They were specifically designed to do a set series of jobs, and they were also getting a little bit old. So that's when we all teamed up and we said, okay, we're going to need a new system, and these systems are not cheap to build. They are extremely time intensive. It requires a high level of skills of software development, and most countries are never ever going to want to go down that process. And it would be very, very silly to say, well, let's say that 110 countries now have to build their own several $1 million integration systems. Firstly, it would never happen. And secondly, if it did, it would be an enormous waste of money. So when we started building the Flint, the very first thing in our heads was, how do we share this? How do we make it reusable? How do we ensure that every country in the world, should they want to use this system, can have access to it? They can have access to it for free, and they can have a community of users that will help them actually implement it. This is why we went down the open source approach. So open source is not necessarily very well understood. I've certainly learned more about open source over the last 5 or 6 years than I care to mention, but there are a few key points. The first thing is that the source code is available. So anyone can get that code, they can look at it, they can modify it, they can distribute it, and they can create products from it. But that is all still licensed. The idea is to really stimulate collaboration and get people working together. As I mentioned just before, that there is still a licensing agreement. There are multiple different types of open source licensing agreement. The specific license agreement for the Flint is an MPL2. We can talk about that later. I think Andrew will probably cover that on day 4. But it's very much I'll share this with you if you share this with me. So it's a sharing collaborative process. There's a number of issues around copyright and copyleft. The point to make, though, with open source is that while all of it is free to download, it is not cost-free. So to use open source, you may need to still hire developers, for example, to use it, or you may need to hire people or buy computers to run it. So open source may not be any cheaper than commercial software overall, but it is likely to be faster. It is definitely likely to be more bug-free. It's more likely to develop more quickly. So that is why we went down the open source approach. Multiple reasons to use open source, and this has been proven time and time again. The quality, the features, because you have so many people coming into it, and we're now really seeing that with the number of contributors from around the world that are starting to make changes in the Flint code base. The fact that you can customize it, you're not locked to a vendor. You can use different vendors to run it. There's cost benefit analyses. There's numerous good reasons to run open source, in particular reducing duplication. The other point with open source that we often hear is, open source isn't really an operational system that we can use. That thinking is obviously a little bit old. And when you look here at all of the visible open source projects that you can see on this little diagram, many of them you have, if not directly used, you have definitely used in your day-to-day life, because they probably underpin many of the software packages, including the Teams package that we're currently running to have this meeting. Definitely the Google Sheets process that I have running here will be running at least some part of these pieces of database or these pieces of software underneath. The amazing fact that is come out recently or over the last few years is that 98% of all software has some form of open source component in it. That is absolutely amazing to me, and it really shows the power of why people are going down open source. And this was a really big driver for creating Moja and making Flint open source. There's some key performance indicators for open source software, and there's a big difference between software where the code is simply put up onto a GitHub account and not managed, and those projects where you still have a reliable control over that so that everyone has confidence in the code itself. And the analogy that we'd like to use here, and we have seen a lot of times in the science world in open source, is the couch boat by the roadside. I write a piece of very interesting software myself. I put it on GitHub and say, here's some free code. Very quickly, that couch that may have been okay, lots of people start hacking into it and doing bits of pieces and doing other things, and it starts to degrade. And you don't then know what that piece of software is. So this was an aspect of open source that has been a problem, but is no longer really a problem when you have an organization like Moja Global. The key performance criteria is we have one license agreed by all. As noted, that's an MPL2 license. We have the one code base. We have one vision, and that one vision is driven through our strategy board, our management boards, and our technical steering committees. We have a buzzing ecosystem. And by that, we mean there's a lot of people interested, and there's more people becoming interested, and there's lots of people contributing to the project. And as I said before, that's exactly what we're starting to see. That there is support inside the ecosystem, and Andrew is going to talk more about that again on day 4. How do you get support if you'd like to implement Flint, or if you would like to get support on documentation? We have some DevOps, and we have a professional legal umbrella. Once open source, always open source. I don't need to go into this too much, but the main point on this slide is that the IP from contributors remains theirs. However, they license that contribution in. So, sorry, there's some background. When Werner writes code into the Flint as part of his work with Canada, Canada remains the owner of that IP, or Werner remains the owner of that IP, depending on how the process works. But as he contributes the code into the organisation, he agrees to license that piece of work, and that provides it to everyone. So this is not about taking IP or anything like that. It's all about how do we share our IP in a very open way. Why open governance? So this is around how do we actually govern the code? Who's in control and how does it get done? All of this leads to a decision point that we made in 2015, I believe, when we were trying to figure out how to set up the open source process around the Flint. Now, one of the problems, as I mentioned before, for open source was that we didn't know how to control the code. How did we make sure that there was a reliable piece of Flint code that everyone could get to, but that we didn't have lots of forking and lots of problems with that? And how do we actually manage that as effectively a not-for-profit? This was the point where we joined the Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation has underpinned the development of Moja Global for the last 6 years. The Linux Foundation, without going into it in too much depth, is a legal entity. It is a not-for-profit organisation. Its key purpose is to help open source projects be managed efficiently and have the greatest impact. So Moja Global and how the Linux Foundation works is that they are the legal entity, they manage all of the finances, and underneath the Linux Foundation are projects. And those projects have the management of the software. So the Linux Foundation manages the accounting and the HR and the marketing and all of those things. Moja Global as a project sits under there. Its job is to facilitate the collaboration. It's definitely, obviously, a not-for-profit and with no commercial interest. And so Moja sits under the Linux Foundation as a project. I'm very happy to talk more about that as needed if there's any questions. But the Linux Foundation does manage huge amounts of open source code under hundreds of different projects, so they are extremely experienced. This diagram may look a little confusing, but there's only 3 to 4 main pieces in here. There are the anybody group, and these are people that want to work on the Flint code. They may wish to write some documentation. They might want to write some science models and run the Flint and show that their science models are more accurate than something else, for example, or could be scaled in some way. This is where anyone can come in and actually use the software, but not just use, actually support and improve the software. That is largely managed by a technical steering committee of volunteers. Andrew and Verna are the key people on those technical steering committees that guide that process. There is a strategy board supported by an advisory board, but the strategy board is setting the direction of the Moja Global organisation. That is made up of users. It is an open governance process. The people on the strategy board are voted in. There has to be a net agreement as to they have to sign an agreement that they will support Moja, and they therefore control the way that moves forward. So some good examples of the users would be, I think the UNFCCC, for example, is on the strategy board, and they will help guide the processes. Underneath that, there is the management board. I'm on the management board, for example, and our role is to implement the decisions of the strategy board. That's pretty much it. It's a really nice, simple process for open source. But what it means is that we have one project, one set of code that gives power to the users in multiple ways. You could have a self-run user. So, for example, your own country can take the Flint, hire their own developers, run their and run your own accounts and run your own Flint. And Canada is a perfect example of that implementation. You can have a user where maybe they hire a company to help them implement that. And that's been implemented in several countries with support from people like climate advisors, for example, and ourselves. And you can provide training into that, or you can buy a software as a service version. So a company can do a commercial version of that. All of these are consistent. They're all running off the same base, and they are all still contributing back to the same open source code. And so that is where Moja Global comes in.